Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look at the Display Dialogs commands inbuilt to PowerBasic. When you are creating a PowerBasic Windows application, there will come a time when you want the user to be able to select either a folder to read from, a folder to write to, or to open or to save a file. The first part of these activities would be allowing the user to select where to read from or to write to. The Windows API provides a number of function calls that would allow this functionality. PowerBasic goes even further and provides a number of wrapper commands to these Windows API calls. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, the Display Dialog commands. We're going to be looking at Display Browse, which allows you to select a folder from your disk. Display OpenFile, which allows you to select a file to open. And finally, Display SaveFile, which allows you to select a file or files to save to. In order to make these individual commands easy to use and understand, we're going to create 3 functions. And each function is going to perform one of these display commands. So we'll start with the Display Browse command. As the purpose of this function is to allow the user to select a folder, we'll want to create a local variable into which we're going to store this folder. And this variable will hold both the path and the name of the folder. So we will create a local variable called folder_pict. And this is going to store our path and name of the folder that has been selected. And we're going to populate this folder by the output of a new function, which we'll call Display Browse. So here is our new function. We're not passing any parameters to this function, but you always could in your own applications. First of all, we're going to create a number of local variables, just to make it easy to populate the parameters of our Display Browse command. And these are the local parameters we're going to create. The first is a parent variable. This is a handle of the parent dialog. This could be the desktop if there is no parent dialog, or it could be the handle of whatever parent has actually triggered this function. The next 2 parameters are the X and Y position coordinates. This is where our new Display Browse dialog is to appear on the screen. The value of these 2 variables is based on the top left-hand corner of the parent dialog. The next parameter is the title. This is a string of text that you want to appear in the Display Browse dialog. This is useful to indicate to the user what they're attempting to do. The next variable is the starting folder path. This is the folder that will initially appear to the user on screen. The next variable is a long variable. This flags variable is used to hold the style attributes of the dialog. This allows you to change the way the dialog will behave. We'll cover that in a moment. The final variable is the folder_pict. This is the variable into which the output from the Display Browse command will place the path and the name of the folder the user has actually selected. If the user clicks on the Cancel button, then this variable will be an empty length string. So let's set up the value of each of these variables. So first of all, we're setting the parent to be the desktop. This is because when this function is called, there are no dialogs showing on screen to the user. If you were calling this from another dialog, then you can put in the handle of that dialog as the parent. Next, we have the X and Y coordinates, in this case being 50, 50. Since we're giving the parent as the desktop, this is the position relative to the top left-hand corner of the desktop. These values are in pixels, so our new dialog for Display Browse will appear at the coordinates 50 by 50 at the top left-hand corner of our screen. Next, we are populating the title variable. This is a piece of text we want the user to see to give them an indication of what we want them to do. In this case, saying the words, "Please select a folder." Next, we're going to populate the start path. This tells PowerBasic which drive and folder we wish to start the dialog at. Next, we will populate the start path. In this case, we're using exe.path$. This is a special command that will instruct PowerBasic to return the value of the folder in which our current executable resides. You can, of course, substitute any other valid path for your application. Next, we're going to set the flags variable. This is the variable that holds the style attributes of the dialog we're about to present to the user. I'm using just a single option here, the new dialog style, which is the default. If we have a look at the Windows help, we can see all the attributes we can actually set on this particular dialog. The only attribute I've picked is the new dialog style, which is the default. If we left the flags variable as unpopulated, we would inherit this style. If we wish the dialog not to allow the user to create a new folder, for example by hiding the new folder button, we can add on this extra attribute. This could be done by using the OR command. You're basically ORing both of these attributes together to give a value to store in the flags variable. I'm using the underline character at the end of the line to fold the line down to the next line. So basically, this allows us to be a single line of code. Now that we've populated each of these variables, we can now call the display browse command. So there is our display browse command with each of its parameters. First of all, the handle to the parent, the X and Y coordinates, the title of the dialog, the start path, the flags, and the variable into which we're putting the output, the folder that the user has picked. In this function, all we need to do now is to return the folder that has been picked to the calling function, like so. So if we go back to our code at the start, now that we have created this function, we will return the value and place it in this variable. In order to let us see which folder has been selected, we'll use a message box command to display this on screen. So if we try running our application now, and so the dialog will appear on screen. This dialog is resizable. And as you'll see at the bottom of the dialog, it has highlighted the folder we're currently in, the code folder. And as we've set the application not to display the new folder button, you'll see that there is no new folder button at the bottom of the screen. If we cancel out of this, we'll see that the folder returned is blank. So if we go back to our function and we take out the line of code that sets the new folder button to be invisible, and we run the application once more, we will see we now have the Make New Folder button appearing on the dialog. So if we click New Folder, we can create a new test folder underneath our code folder. And we can name that. And now that it's highlighted, if we click OK, our message box will return the path to our test folder. So we have successfully used a function to allow the user to select a folder from their computer. Next, we're going to look at Display OpenFile. There will be times in your application when you will prompt the user to select a file to open for reading. You may, of course, want the user to open multiple files. So this command in the Display OpenFile allows for both single and multiple files opening. So we're going to create two local variables to allow us to do this. The first being a variable called file count. This will count the number of files that have been selected by the user. The second variable will contain either the path and name of a single file or the path and the names of multiple files. So as we did before, we're going to call a new function to allow us to access this command easily. And we'll call this function OpenFile. And we're going to pass to it the variable file count. And the output from this function is going to be the files variable. This will be the path and name of a single file or the path and the names of multiple files. So let's go and create that new function. So this is the skeleton of our new function with its passed parameter, the file count, and returning, in this case, a string. I've named the parameter as O_long file count. This is to indicate, for my documentation purposes, that this variable is an output variable from this function. So we have a very similar list of variables as we had in the previous function. For example, the handle for the parent dialog, the x and y coordinates, the title, a variable to hold the starting point, the folder which we want to begin at, plus we have added a new one called filter. This is to allow us to filter in the dialog the files the user can actually see. As we're going to be opening a file, we'll probably know which file type we're going to be loading. Is it a text file? Is it a BASIC file with a BAS extension or an INC extension? Then we can default to having the starting file name. This allows us to pre-select a name which will be the default, so if the user just clicks OK, it will attempt to load that one. We can also have a default extension. This is a default extension on the file name, for example, .txt. And then we have the flags as we had before, which are the style attributes of the dialog. And we have a files variable which is going to contain the path plus the name of the file or files that the user has selected. And finally, we have a long variable which is going to contain the number of files the user has selected. So as before, we're going to populate each of those variables. The first ones are exactly the same as we had in the last function. The parent, the x and y coordinates, the title, and the initial folder. Next, we're going to populate the filter, and it has a particular way of doing it. The filter variable is a null delimited string. We have a piece of text, which can be anything you wish. In this case, we're putting the word basic, followed by a $0, which is a null. We're adding on to that string the *.bas. This is the filter we wish the user to actually see and to filter the data that appears on the dialog. And we follow that with a final $0. Additionally, you can also use the $. Command slightly differently and a little less verbose, as shown in the two commented outlines. The first one duplicates the very first line. We have the $, followed by basic, 0, the wildcard, *.bas, and then a 0 at the end. Alternatively, if you wish the user to pick from a selection of different types of files, for example BAS files, INC files, and .back, we can use the final option, which will display to the user all three extension types. Next, I'm going to set the start and the default extension variables. I'm going to leave these as empty length strings. And finally, we can set the flags. I'm setting the flags in this case to say that the file must exist and to allow the user to multi-select files. And then we can use the display OpenFile command to prompt the user for the files to open. As before, this command takes a number of parameters, which are all the variables we have populated: the parent, the x and y coordinates, the title, the initial starting folder, the filter we wish to apply, the start, the default extension, the flags attribute, and the two variables we're outputting to. First of all, the files variable, which will contain the path and the names of the files, and the second variable is the number of files the user has selected. If we look at the help file for PowerBasic Windows, we will see there are a number of other attributes we can actually use. Which of these you actually have in your own application will depend what you want the user to see and how you want this particular dialog to behave. As before, if the user selects no files at all, then the number of files selected will be 0 and the str files variable will be an empty length string. But the final task within this function is to return the number of files selected and the path and name, like so. So now that we have populated that, we can now go back to our calling function. So we have populated two variables, the files variable and the file count variable. At this point in time, we don't know how many files the user has actually selected. And the way PowerBasic and Windows returns this list of files is slightly different for a single file as it is for multiple files. For a single file, it will return the actual path and name as one string. If multiple files have been selected, the return in the files variable is slightly different. It returns a delimited list. The first element is the path to the folder the user has selected, and the next elements are going to be one for each of the file names selected. And all of this is delimited by the null character. So we're going to create a return file list function, as that's quite useful to keep our code nice and tidy. So we will create a new file called return file list, taking its two parameters, first of all the file count, and secondly the files variable. So let's go and create this new function, as we will need this function for the save file dialog as well. So here is the skeleton of our new function, taking its two parameters, the file count and the files variable. If the file count is 1, then it is a single file that user has selected, and we can return quite simply the files variable to the calling function. If the file count variable contains a value greater than 1, then multiple files have been selected. So we can then attempt to return something to the user that will be displayable on screen. So we're going to create a number of local variables. We know that there are a number of elements in this string, so that will be our parameter count. The very first element of our file string is going to be the path to the folder containing our files. And we'll want to return to the user a file list. So first we will populate the path variable. We can do that quite easily by using the parse command, taking its three parameters. The first parameter being the variable containing the string. The second is the delimiter, in this case $0, which is a null. And the final parameter is the element. So we're looking for the first element in the string. Next, we're going to build up our file list. So we will initialize our file list as an empty len string. Now we're going to look at each element of the string starting from the second element. And we will add to the file list variable for each of the values, taking what's in the file list previously, adding on the path which we have stored in our path variable, and then using the parse command in exactly the same way to pull out the element that we are interested in. And we're adding on a carriage return line feed so it will look quite tidy on screen to our user. So if we go back to our calling function, the output from this function which we have just created will be our list. So if we try running our application now, it will show first of all the browsing for the folder. So we will click OK on that one and get the value back. And we're now into our second dialog. Now, as you will see, this dialog has the folder which we've specified. We have a number of files which are all of the basic variety. So if we pick both of the files and hit open, the return is the path to both of these files, the path and the name. If we run the application once more, we'll do the first one, and in our second one we will pick a single file, and it will return just the path and name of that single file. So what we've achieved in this function is the ability to select one or more than one file. If we wanted our user to only select a single file and not to have the option for multiple files, then we would change the attributes of our command when we call the display OpenFile. Now we come to the last display command in today's video, which is display SaveFile. Again, with the OpenFile, with the SaveFile, you will have in your own applications the need for saving to files. And in some cases, the user will have no option to where the file is saved. But where you wish to give the user the option where to save a file, this display SaveFile command is very useful and time-saving. So as we did before, we'll create a couple of local variables, the first being the file to save. I'm populating that with the name testfile.txt. There may be times when you want the user to pick the name of the file to save, or other times where you want to impose the file name. Here today we're imposing the file name of testfile.txt. Next, you want to store the returned file path. So as we did before, we're going to create a little function to allow us to save this file. And having saved the file and stored the path that the user has selected, we can then call our message box command with the return file list which we have created a moment ago to display the details to the screen. As with the OpenFile command, the SaveFile command doesn't actually save a file, but it does give you a mechanism by which the user can actually select where it's to be saved. So let's now go and create our SaveFile function. As we did before, we're passing two parameters. We're passing the name of the file to save and an output variable which is going to be the file count returned by this function. And the function itself also returns a string. We've created a number of local variables which will be starting to look very familiar. The parent, the X and Y positions, the title, the initial folder, the filter for what appears to the user on the dialog, the default extension, the flags attribute, and the files variable, which will contain the path plus the name of the file or files selected, and finally the number of files selected. And as we did before, we're going to populate each of these variables. The parent is going to be the desktop, the X and Y positions are going to be 50-50, we will populate the title, we will set the initial folder path, next we will populate the filter to limit the number of files the user can see on the dialog. And we're going to set the default extension in this case to be txt. So if the user types in a file name, this will add txt as the extension. And we have the flags attribute. As with the other commands, there are a number of options for our flags attribute, as seen here. Although we're setting the user to save a file or files, the user can have a multi-select option. And we're setting the overwrite prompt to allow the user in this case to pick a file that may already exist. If you do not want the user overwriting files that already exist, you merely have to remove this attribute. So we're now calling display SaveFile with all its parameters, just as we did before for the OpenFile. And this command outputs to the files and the files selected variables. And as we did before, we can return these to the calling function. So having got this in place, let's try running the application once more. So there is our browse for folder, returning its path. We now have the file for opening. And our final one is to select a file saving location and file. As we specified the default name, it is already pre-populated. The user can then change the folder, and they have the option of changing the file name. And if they hit save, it will come back with the path for the test folder and the name that they have selected. So in summary, what we've covered today are three of the standard display dialogs. Display browse to allow you to select a folder, display save file, and display load file. Using these standard display dialogs gives you two advantages. First of all, it presents to the user a standard way of performing these actions, which should be the same in almost all applications, so the user will be familiar with what's happening. Secondly, it saves you time creating the dialogues yourself, which is always a good thing. There are two more display dialogs, but we'll cover those in the next video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.